Princess and emerged from Windsor Castle at 11:22 this morning, her face set in an expression that those who know her recognized immediately as controlled devastation. She had just left an emergency family meeting that lasted 4 hours and ended with a decision so difficult that even Anne, renowned for her emotional restraint, struggled to maintain composure. What she was about to announce would change the royal family forever. The meeting had never been meant to happen, and the message that followed did not arrive loudly or widely. Instead, it moved through a narrow corridor of authority reserved for moments when routine collapsed. Those who received it recognized the format instantly. No subject line, no justification, no softening language, only a brief, unmistakable instruction that her presence was required at Windsor as soon as dawn allowed. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, movement was already underway along private roads and secured entrances that rarely appeared on maps. Vehicles arrived separately, deliberately staggered, without escorts or visible security details, not for appearances, but for control. Princess and entered the meeting room first, carrying no papers and making no calls. She requested no notes, needing not a briefing but alignment. She took her seat at the long table without ceremony and waited. King Charles III arrived next, his expression reflecting exhaustion rather than alarm, the look of someone who had spent the night absorbing information rather than reacting to it. King Charles paused briefly at the doorway, taking in the room as if measuring its capacity to contain what was about to be discussed, then sat, setting aside the usual markers of hierarchy in favor of immediacy. Prince William arrived last, without staff, folders, or the usual signals of preparation. His presence carried a weight that went beyond observation or apprenticeship. No communications officials, legal advisors, or aides were present to shape language or manage risk. The room itself had been stripped of anything that might soften the conversation. Curtains drawn not for secrecy, but for focus, the long table bare of water glasses, folders, or briefing packs, leaving only space and attention. Silence hung in the air, not as hesitation but as recalibration, a recognition that familiar protocols of delay, adjustment, and managed disclosure had already been exhausted. The information prompting the gathering had arrived the previous evening, unfiltered and uncompromising, accompanied by documentation that closed doors rather than opened them. King Charles broke the stillness with a question that carried neither defensiveness nor strategy. Could silence remain an option? The answer was evident on the faces around the table. Princess Anne spoke first, stating plainly that silence had already begun to cause damage. What had once been discretion had become misrepresentation, and the institution itself was now at risk. Prince William listened intently, understanding that the meeting's significance lay not only in the facts, but in timing decisions made here would set precedent for how truth would be handled when it could no longer be shaped. As details were reviewed, it became clear that this was not a crisis to be quietly absorbed. The implications reached beyond family concern into the very architecture of responsibility and continuity. Delayed knowledge would shift narrative control elsewhere, and Princess Anne emphasized that history judged institutions not for facing tragedy, but for evasion. Credibility was preserved not by caution, but by clarity. No disagreement was voiced, but the participants visibly adjusted, realizing the mechanisms they had relied on for decades were insufficient. Incremental disclosure or staged reassurance would not suffice. Prince William's posture shifted, moving from absorbing information to anticipating consequence. He understood that the decisions made in this room would accelerate his own transition in ways preparation alone could not mitigate. By the conclusion of the discussion, what began as an urgent gathering had transformed into a moment of institutional self-definition. The discussion had reached a point where the participants were no longer asking how to proceed, but who they were willing to be seen as when the truth was finally spoken. Only one question remained, not whether acknowledgement would come, but who could deliver it without delusion, defensiveness, or misdirection. The answer went unspoken. Almost unanimously, the room turned toward Princess and the line that could not be crossed. She waited longer than anyone expected before speaking, allowing the silence to settle not from hesitation, but by design. In that pause, the room recalibrated, the urgency that had drawn them together giving way to precise attention. When she finally spoke, it was without preface, addressing not the facts already discussed, but the framework through which the family had approached them until now. Management, she stated plainly, had exhausted its usefulness. This moment was no longer logistical or presentational, it had entered moral territory, and moral territory did not respond to strategy. Her authority was never asserted, it was simply assumed. Decades of service had earned her a position built not on affection or fear, but on reliability and consistency. When she intervened, it was understood that delay itself had become a decision, and she outlined the narrowing reality with clinical precision. The family had only two options: speak with accuracy and restraint, or allow the truth to emerge fragmented, shaped by others with less information and fewer constraints. There was no third path, and time was no longer neutral. It actively eroded credibility. King Charles listened without interruption, his stillness not indecision, but recognition that caution could no longer serve its purpose, and turned her attention to Prince William, not to instruct, but to include him in the responsibility that would shape his future. The institution, she reminded him, could survive loss, but it could not survive the impression that it avoided truth when inconvenient. The residue of such avoidance lingered far longer than the moment itself. Her words reframed the discussion, shifting it from managing consequences to upholding responsibility, making clear that the goal was not family comfort, but institutional survival. The critical shift came when she defined the boundaries of what could be said publicly. The statement must not minimize the situation, nor imply that outcomes remained uncertain when they were already determined. The statement, Princess emphasized, must not minimize the situation or suggest that deliberation was ongoing. If the decision had already been made, any implication otherwise would constitute misdirection, intentional or not. Her clarity disrupted the lingering instinct to shield by omission, reframing disclosure not as exposure but as stewardship. The monarchy, she reminded them, had never survived by pretending difficulty did not exist. It endured by facing hardship without distortion. Unease filled the room, though no one voiced it aloud. The discomfort arose not from disagreement, but from consequence. Once spoken plainly, the truth could not be retrieved or reshaped, and acknowledged this fear without yielding to it, reminding the family that permanence was already present. The events had occurred, and the only choice remaining was whether acknowledgement would be guided by integrity or calculation. History, she noted quietly, rarely forgave the latter. When the practical question arose of who should deliver the message, and let the silence linger, allowing the answer to become obvious. Her credibility in moments of institutional strain was widely recognized both within and beyond the family. When she agreed to speak, it was conditional. The statement would be factual, contained, free of conjecture, future speculation, or emotional display. Tragedy, she insisted, required no embellishment. Prince William acknowledged this with a single nod, signaling acceptance not only of the plan, but of the philosophical shift it represented. The focus was no longer comfort, but preventing further harm. The meeting ended without closing remarks or reassurance. The path forward had narrowed decisively. Princess Anne would speak, the family would support her words without qualification, and the consequences would be met without revision. There was no relief, only resolve. The tragedy itself was not created there, but its acknowledgement would begin under the line Princess and refused anyone to cross. The confirmation arrived not as drama, but as conclusion, reflecting a trajectory quietly unfolding behind caution and restraint. The briefing materials were precise and unsentimental, showing that medical assessments had converged and uncertainty now existed only in duration, stripped of illusion, and requested a review of the sequence from the beginning not out of unfamiliarity, but to ensure absolute clarity, knowing that even unintentional ambiguity became a liability the moment it left the room. Every word spoken publicly would be measured against what was already known privately. As the timeline was restated, the emotional temperature shifted almost imperceptibly. The earlier months, once framed as cautious optimism, now read as postponement, and decisions that had felt prudent at the time revealed themselves as temporary shelters against inevitability. No one in the room could escape the realization that hope had been doing work it was never meant to carry alone. The development concerned a senior figure whose role extended far beyond family bonds, touching continuity, expectation, and the psychological center of the monarchy. Its implications radiated outward, influencing not just personal relationships, but also the pace at which responsibility would need to be assumed elsewhere. Prince William absorbed this in silence, recognizing that what remained was no longer emotional preparation for a possible future, but acceptance that the future was arriving on terms beyond their control. The line between personal life and public duty collapsed. King Charles spoke quietly, carefully weighing words shaped by experience and fatigue, acknowledging that earlier choices had sought to preserve stability, and that discretion had once been compassionate, but now, he saw, discretion had reached its limit. Princess Anne responded not with criticism, but with reframing. Discretion had become distortion. The longer truth remained unspoken, the more harm its eventual emergence would cause. Silence no longer protected, it amplified damage. The shift was subtle, but decisive. What began as an assessment became acknowledgement. The tragedy now had shape, direction, and consequences that would not wait for institutional readiness, and emphasized that public language could not suggest reversibility, because false hope was cruelty disguised as kindness. The gravity of this realization settled over the family. Some truths resist management. No one argued. The facts themselves carried authority. The final question was not whether the news would be shared, but how without softening reality or amplifying pain. Restraint, not reassurance, would guide the message. The public needed honesty, not consolation. By the end of the discussion, the emotional weight of the news was fully absorbed, met not with collapse, but with resolve, a recognition that this moment would define both the immediate weeks and the long-term moral posture of the family. The consequences of acknowledgement began unfolding even before a statement was issued. Within the household, the atmosphere shifted in ways subtle yet unmistakable. Conversations slowed, movements became deliberate, and the sense that they were standing at the edge of something irreversible permeated every action. For some, the meeting forced confrontation with carefully compartmentalized fears. For others, it confirmed unspoken suspicions. The protective distance between anticipation and acceptance dissolved. Prince William withdrew in the hours that followed, not in avoidance, but in necessity, recalibrating in real time as the responsibilities he had long prepared for pressed closer, immediate and personal. King Charles remained visible, but quieter than usual, interacting with advisors methodically, focused on continuity rather than reaction, a family navigating the irrevocable weight of acknowledgement. King Charles understood that leadership in moments like this required steadiness, not sentiment. His demeanor communicated to those watching that the institution would not fracture under the strain of truth. Princess Anne, having accepted the role of messenger, shifted into a mode of meticulous precision, reviewing drafts with near-severe exactness. Each phrase was scrutinized not for how it sounded, but for what it allowed others to infer. She rejected language that implied possibility where none existed and cautioned against wording that invited speculation through omission. Generational differences within the family became more visible. Older members, shaped by decades of instinctive restraint, struggled with the accelerating pace of events, while younger members recognized that time had become an adversary rather than a tool. Private discussions revealed long-standing philosophical divisions over transparency and modernization. These were not arguments, but reckonings. Decisions made years earlier were re-evaluated under the harsh clarity of present consequence. Some acknowledged privately that caution had slipped into avoidance, while others recognized the unforeseen costs of openness. Later that day, Princess Anne addressed these tensions in a smaller gathering, emphasizing that disagreement was not disloyalty, but internal contradiction after the statement's delivery would be disastrous. The family would stand publicly united, even if private emotions remained unsettled. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate family. Senior staff adjusted schedules quietly. Protocols once theoretical were activated without fanfare, and the machinery of the institution responded with controlled adaptation. This was not chaos, it was gravity. As evening approached, a sense of waiting settled over the household. The statement was finalized, timing agreed, and nothing remained to negotiate. Everyone understood that once spoken, the words would permanently alter the landscape. There was no expectation that acknowledgement would ease future pain, but it was universally recognized that refusal to confront the truth would corrode trust beyond repair. The family had crossed from preservation into responsibility. The tragedy itself had existed long before, pressing against silence. What changed now was that the family had chosen to meet it openly, without disguise, and once that choice was made, there could be no turning back. There could be no return to the comfort of not knowing. The decision to have Princess Anne speak publicly was not ceremonial. It was strategic, deliberate, and rooted in an understanding of how credibility functions when trust is strained. Within the family, there was quiet consensus that no one else could deliver the message without it being filtered through expectation, sympathy, or suspicion. Anne's reputation for directness was not merely an asset, it was the point. The statement was scheduled for late morning, timed carefully, but without the usual choreography accompanying major royal communications. No advanced briefings, no background reassurances, no intermediaries. The words were to stand alone, unshielded by interpretation. In the hours before the announcement, Anne reviewed the text alone, declining the presence of aides, asking instead for silence and space. This was not defiance, but focus. Every word would be scrutinized not just for meaning, but for intent and ambiguity. Even accidental would be treated as evasion. The statement itself was spare, austere, opening without preamble, expressions of gratitude, or appeals for understanding, and identified the development directly, confirming that the family faced circumstances beyond earlier expectations, acknowledging the seriousness without dramatization, choosing clarity over comfort. What the statement omitted was as important as what it included. No timelines, no projections framed as possibilities, no language inviting speculation or false reassurance. No promises of updates, no suggestion that matters were under review. Every absence was intentional. To include them would have been dishonest. She spoke slowly, her tone measured, unadorned, conveying gravity through restraint rather than display. A brief pause was not for composure, but for precision, clarifying that the family spoke now because silence no longer served the public, or themselves a sentence heavier than any expression of sorrow, framing the statement not as concession but responsibility. The reaction was immediate and global. The statement circulated verbatim within minutes, analysts noting the absence of euphemism, commentators highlighting the lack of narrative framing. For a public accustomed to carefully managed messaging, the starkness was disorienting, but precisely that disorientation recalibrated trust. By refusing to shape emotional response and allowed the facts to speak, the public was informed, not instructed. Inside the household, the delivery marked a shift from anticipation to consequence. There was no applause, no relief. Acknowledgement was not an endpoint, but a threshold. King Charles was informed immediately. He requested no revisions, accepting the moment as final, quietly affirming that the family had done what was required, not what was comfortable. Prince William, watching privately, remained silent for several minutes, recognizing that the statement narrowed the distance between present responsibility and future role. What was now public would shape every private decision. Public response evolved rapidly from initial shock to sober analysis, with surprisingly little outrage or speculation. The clarity of the statement constrained excess, naming the situation without embellishment and limiting the space in which rumor could thrive. Scholars, commentators, and observers across disciplines noted the unusual candor of the statement. Some questioned whether the family had waited too long. Others suggested that speaking earlier might not have altered the outcome, only the timing of reckoning. What united most reactions, however, was recognition that the moment had been handled with gravity rather than calculation. Princess Anne did not engage further after the statement. She declined interviews and issued no follow-up commentary, understanding that her role was complete. To continue speaking would have diluted the clarity she had established. In the days that followed, the statement was repeatedly referenced as a turning point, not simply for its content, but for what it represented: a willingness to acknowledge limitations and a refusal to trade honesty for comfort. For Anne, the task had never been about managing reaction. It had been about marking a line between silence and truth, and once crossed, there could be no retreat. The statement did not resolve the tragedy it acknowledged, but it achieved something more enduring. It altered the relationship between the family and the public, showing that candor could prevail over preservation. And in that shift, the institution took on a different weight, perhaps more fragile, but also more credible. Afterward, there was no return to routine. Normality, so often invoked after royal crises, did not apply here. What Anne had confirmed did not create chaos, but it reshaped the family's internal rhythm irreversibly. A line had been crossed not by circumstance alone, but by choice, and public choice reshapes everything that follows. Inside the household, the first change was a quieter, more deliberate stillness different from the heavy avoidance that had preceded acknowledgement. Conversations became fewer but more purposeful. Decisions that might once have been deferred were now addressed directly. The illusion of time as a buffer had vanished. For Anne, the aftermath was about stewardship rather than visibility. Having spoken once, she withdrew deliberately, offering no clarifications or softening remarks. Truth, once stated plainly, required no repetition. Elaboration invited reinterpretation, and reinterpretation weakened clarity. King Charles understood this instinctively. making no public gestures to counterbalance the weight of the announcement. There were no surprise appearances, no symbolic events staged to project continuity. His restraint conveyed a private, disciplined resilience. Preparations across the institution accelerated not with urgency, but with inevitability. Contingency plans were revisited and refined. Responsibilities were subtly redistributed without public explanation. Within the household, the shift was apparent. Authority leaned forward, not abruptly, but decisively. Prince William's role began changing in observable ways. His presence at briefings increased, his involvement in long-term planning deepened. The distinction between supporting and leading narrowed not from ambition, but from necessity. The future had drawn closer, carrying a gravity that preparation alone could not fully mitigate. For the wider family, acknowledgement forced recalibration. Some bonds tightened under shared reality, others strained, not through conflict, but through the quiet recognition that paths were diverging. Tragedy clarified priorities, and not everyone arrived at the same conclusions. In the weeks that followed, public response continued to evolve. Initial analysis gave way to reflection, and the absence of follow-up statements created space for restraint, something increasingly rare in moments of public grief. Without constant commentary from the palace, speculation slowed, and the clarity of the original acknowledgement left little room for narrative expansion. Media coverage shifted accordingly, contextualizing the moment historically rather than chasing fragments of information. Comparisons were drawn to earlier periods when the monarchy faced irreversible change. But what distinguished this moment was not the severity of circumstance, but the manner of response. There had been no attempt to reframe reality as resilience. The family had allowed the truth to stand without embellishment. That choice carried consequences beyond reputation. It altered expectations. The public, addressed candidly, recalibrated its relationship with the institution, and sympathy replaced suspicion, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had been named honestly. Inside the palace, the shift was noted with cautious relief. Trust, once eroded, is rarely restored quickly, but it can be stabilized, and Princess had done so not through charm or sentiment, but through credibility. The emotional toll within the family remained largely unseen. As always, for acknowledgement did not lessen grief, it removed the burden of pretending grief was not approaching. In some ways, truth created space for privacy rather than destroying it. Over the following weeks, the absence of dramatic escalation became notable. No leaks contradicted the statement, no anonymous briefings sought to soften its meaning. The family held the line, and silence in this context became a continuation of honesty rather than avoidance. Long-term implications surfaced quietly. Discussions about modernization gained urgency, and the balance between privacy and public duty was re-examined not theoretically, but practically. Decisions once deferred out of fear of destabilization were reconsidered through a new lens. Stability did not depend on concealment. Princess Anne's role in this recalibration was subtle but decisive. Though she rarely spoke publicly after the announcement, her influence shaped tone and approach, advocating fewer statements, consistency over reaction, clarity over reassurance. Subsequent adjustments, whether to engagements or responsibilities, were executed quietly, without commentary, signaling deliberate rather than performative action. For Prince William, this period marked the beginning of a different kind of preparation. No longer abstract, his future responsibilities became tangible, navigated privately and with steadiness rather than declaration. Observers noted the shift even at a distance. The monarchy appeared less performative, more deliberate. That change was not universally praised, but it commanded respect. The tragedy acknowledged by Princess, and did not conclude the story, it reframed it. What followed was not resolution, but adaptation. The family moved from anticipation to acceptance, from preparation to practice. The most enduring consequence of the moment was not the news itself, but the precedent it set. When circumstances demanded truth, the institution would not hide behind language or delay behind process. It would speak plainly once and stand by its words. That choice did not make the future easier, but it made it clearer, and clarity, in moments of irreversible change, became its own form of strength.